There is no land like this in the world. Rapa Nui sits alone in the southeastern Pacific Ocean, surrounded by more open water than any other inhabited island on Earth. 2,300 miles from the nearest coastline of Chile, 1,300 miles from Pitcairn, the next fragment of land to the west. To fly there today is to spend 5 hours looking at nothing but blue water in every direction, the horizon unbroken, the ocean beneath featureless, the sky and the sea meeting at a circle that slowly rotates as the aircraft turns. The island itself is small, 63 square miles of volcanic rock rising from the ocean floor, the tips of 3 extinct volcanoes that have been quiet for long enough to accumulate soil, to grow grass and scrub, to develop the specific character of a place that has been isolated for so long that its biology went its own way, that the species here are found nowhere else on Earth. On the morning of April 5, 1722, a Dutch explorer named Jacob Roggeveen brought his 3 ships to anchor off the island's coast. It was Easter Sunday, which is why the charts he drew that day named the place Easter Island. What Roggeveen found when he brought his crew ashore was not what any European had seen before. The island was inhabited, clearly and substantially. The people who came to meet him were Polynesian, tall and well-built, with tattooed faces, and they lived on an island that was bare of large trees, a landscape of grass and fern and the occasional small shrub, stretching up to volcanic heights at either end. But the island was not bare in the way of an uninhabited place. It was covered with constructions, stone platforms along the coast, massive structures of fitted basalt, and standing on those platforms, the figures, the Moai. In 1722, when Roggeveen arrived, the Moai were still standing, still upright on their platforms, facing inland across the landscape, with blank, deep-set eyes. The tradition, at that time, was to carve white coral irises and red scoria or obsidian pupils into the eye sockets during ceremonies, and when Roggeveen arrived in the night, his crew saw the islanders lighting fires and lying prostrate before the statues in what appeared to be worship. In the full light of day, the stone figures looked different from any statuary the Europeans had ever encountered, massive, austere, the heads disproportionately large relative to the compressed bodies, the faces serene and commanding, the ears long, the chins prominent. They stood on platforms of carefully fitted stone that were themselves the foundations of a complex system of belief and social structure that Roggeveen had no way of understanding. He estimated the population at between 2,000 and 3,000 people. He noted the bareness of the landscape. He noted the statues. He noted that the island appeared to be prosperous enough for its population, with cultivation visible in the interior and chickens kept in quantity. Then he sailed away. The story that would eventually be told about Easter Island, the story that became the dominant narrative for most of the 20th century, and that shaped how millions of people thought about the island and its people, was not Roggeveen's story. It was a story assembled over the following 2 centuries from partial information, colonial assumptions, and a specific interpretive framework about what happens to civilizations that damage their own environments. The story went like this. Once, Easter Island had been a paradise of vast palm forests. The Polynesian settlers, who arrived sometime in the first millennium of the Common Era, found an island covered in trees, and over the following centuries they built a sophisticated culture, raised their remarkable statues, and then destroyed themselves, cutting down every tree, eliminating every forest, eroding their soil, collapsing their food supply, fighting over what remained, and toppling each other's statues in a final fury of civilizational self-destruction. By the time Europeans arrived, the story said, the collapse had already happened. They were looking at the ruins. This narrative received its most polished and influential form in 2005, when the American geographer Jared Diamond published Collapse: How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed, a book that became an international bestseller and that used Easter Island as its central example of what Diamond called ecocide, the self-inflicted destruction of a civilization by the degradation of its own environment. Diamond's account was compelling, detailed, and read by millions of people. It placed Easter Island at the center of a moral fable about environmental destruction, a warning to industrial civilization about the consequences of consuming the natural resources on which life depends. The islanders cut down the last tree, Diamond suggested, knowing it was the last tree, unable or unwilling to stop themselves, when they died for it. There was only one problem with this story: it was not true. And the evidence that disproved it had been accumulating in the archaeological record for years before it was assembled into a coherent counter-narrative by the American archaeologists Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo, whose work on Rapa Nui across the 1990s and 2000s would eventually overturn the ecocide hypothesis and replace it with a far more disturbing truth, not about what the Rapa Nui people did to themselves, but about what was done to them. To understand the revision, it is necessary to first understand the island itself, what it is and what it was, and who the people were who made it their home. Rapa Nui, as the island has been known to its Polynesian inhabitants for as long as they have had a name for it, is volcanic in origin, built up from the ocean floor by 3 distinct volcanic centers that are now extinct. The youngest and most prominent is Rano Kau, in the southwest, whose caldera holds a spectacular freshwater lake ringed by totora reeds. Poike is the oldest, forming the eastern peninsula, its slopes eroded by time into the specific rounded shape of long extinct cones. And in the center and to the north sits Terevaka, the island's highest point, from which on a clear day the horizon is visible in every direction, and the full isolation of the island impresses itself on the visitor with physical force. When Polynesians first arrived at this island, probably around 1200 CE, though the exact date is debated, they found something genuinely remarkable: a subtropical island that was, in botanical terms, a forest. The dominant species was a giant palm, closely related to the Chilean wine palm, which grew tall enough and straight enough to serve as timber for canoes and for whatever else the settlers needed. There were also other plant species, ferns, sedges, and the various small trees and shrubs typical of isolated Pacific islands, and together these formed a forest that was, by the standards of tropical Polynesia, unusual in its composition, but substantial in its coverage. The forest did not survive the arrival of the settlers. By the time Roggeveen arrived, it was gone. The question that has driven the debate about Rapa Nui's history is simple: what happened to it, and what happened to the people who lived under it? The conventional answer, Diamond's answer, was that the people cut it down, all of it, over several centuries of statue building and canoe building and fuel gathering and agricultural clearing, and that the deforestation was their own doing, their own fault, their own ruin. The statues themselves, in this account, became evidence of the excess that destroyed the civilization, the vast labor and the massive timber consumption of the statue-building culture, representing the irrational expenditure of finite resources by a people who were sawing off the branch they were sitting on. The archaeological evidence assembled by Hunt and Lipo tells a different and more complex story. It begins with a small brown animal, Ratus exulans, the Pacific rat, which the Polynesian settlers brought with them to every island they colonized, as an inadvertent companion, a hitchhiker in the hulls of canoes, a food source in extremity, and an ecological catastrophe in every Virgin Island ecosystem they entered. The Pacific rat is extraordinarily prolific, a population given sufficient food and the absence of predators, which is precisely what a newly colonized island offers, can double every 47 days. From a handful of animals arriving with the first canoes, a population can grow to hundreds of thousands within a few years. And the Pacific rat has a specific and devastating habit. It eats seeds. It gnaws through the husks of nuts and palm seeds to reach the nutritious interior. It is, in effect, a seed predator, and its effect on any forest ecosystem whose dominant trees rely on seeds for reproduction is not merely damaging, but potentially permanent, because a forest that cannot regenerate from its own seeds will eventually die without replacement. The palm forests of Rapa Nui were exactly the kind of ecosystem that a seed predator could destroy. The large palm nuts, which would have been abundant and attractive to the rats, became increasingly rare as the rat population consumed them faster than the trees could produce them. The trees died, one by one, over decades and centuries, and no new palms grew to replace them, because the seeds that should have become new palms were being eaten. The palms disappeared not primarily because humans cut them down, though humans certainly did cut some of them, but because the rats prevented the forest from regenerating. The deforestation of Rapa Nui was a joint enterprise of human settlement and the ecological cascade that human settlement inevitably triggered, not a deliberate act of self-destruction by people too short-sighted to see what they were doing. This matters enormously for the moral of the story. The ecocide narrative required the Rapa Nui people to be agents of their own destruction, to have made a choice, however irrational, to consume their island's resources faster than those resources could recover. The rat hypothesis removes that moral agency from the equation, or at least distributes it differently. The settlers of Rapa Nui did not destroy their forest. They brought the animals that destroyed it, and those animals acted as they always act. This is a different kind of tragedy, one that says something quite different about the relationship between human action and environmental consequence. But the rat hypothesis is only the first piece of the revised picture. It dismantles the mechanism of the supposed collapse. Population data, examined by Hunt, Lipo, and their colleagues, dismantles the collapse itself. Diamond's version of the Easter Island story required a large population. He estimated that the island may have held 15,000 to 20,000 people at its peak, before the collapse reduced that number to a remnant of 2,000 or 3,000 by the time Europeans arrived. This large population was necessary to explain both the enormous labor investment that the Moai represented and the catastrophic nature of the collapse that followed. 20,000 people suddenly reduced to 2,000 is a dramatic civilizational crash. 2,000 people maintaining a stable population of 2,000 is something else entirely. When Hunt and his colleagues examined the archaeological record more carefully, what they found was that the population of Rapa Nui had probably never been more than 3,000 people. The island is small. Its carrying capacity, meaning the number of people it could support at a sustainable level of resource consumption, is limited by its size and its agricultural potential. A population of 2,000 to 3,000 was not the remnant of a collapsed civilization. It was the population of a stable, functioning society that had adapted itself to its environment with remarkable ingenuity. The evidence of that ingenuity is still visible on Rapa Nui today, if you know where to look. Across the interior of the island, in the areas that were once cultivated, there is a specific pattern of rock placement that archaeologists call lithic mulching. Thousands upon thousands of rocks, gathered and placed in specific configurations around garden plots, creating a microenvironment that modifies the soil conditions in several beneficial ways simultaneously. The rocks absorb heat during the day and release it slowly at night, moderating the temperature extremes that characterize a small oceanic island. They trap moisture, reducing evaporation and making the most of the island's limited rainfall. They prevent soil erosion by wind and water, protecting the thin volcanic soils that are all the island has to offer for agriculture. And as the rocks weather slowly, they release minerals into the soil, supplementing the nutrients that the plants extract. This technique, which archaeologists have recognized in multiple locations across the Pacific, requires a sophisticated understanding of soil science and agricultural ecology, even if that understanding is encoded in practice rather than in theory. It is the knowledge system of people who have been farming the same land for generations and who have learned, through careful observation and accumulated experience, what works and what does not. It is not the knowledge system of a civilization in crisis, of a people reduced to desperate measures by a collapsing environment. It is the knowledge system of a people who have found a sustainable way to live in a challenging environment and who have been refining that way of life across many generations. The chickens, which Roggeveen noted in 1722 and which were kept in large stone chicken houses that are still present across the island, provided protein in an environment where deforestation had reduced the bird populations that would otherwise have supplemented the diet, and where the open ocean canoe fishing that characterized most Polynesian island economies was limited by the island's lack of sheltered harbors and the absence of large timber for canoe construction. The chicken economy of Rapa Nui represents another adaptation, another intelligent response to the specific conditions of the island, rather than the subsistence desperation of a society at the end of its resources. When the archaeological evidence for population size, agricultural productivity, and dietary sufficiency is examined, what emerges is not the picture of a society in collapse, but the picture of a society under pressure, certainly, living in a challenging environment, certainly, but managing that environment with considerable skill and maintaining a population at a level that the island could support. The supposed collapse before European contact, the catastrophic crash from 20,000 to 2,000 that Diamond's narrative required, appears not to have happened. And then there are the statues. The Moai of Rapa Nui are among the most immediately recognizable human creations in the world. 900 of them, in various states of completion and preservation, are distributed around the island in a pattern that reflects the social geography of the civilization that made them. They cluster along the coast, on the Ahu platforms that the clans of Rapa Nui built and maintained as the sacred centers of their social and religious lives. They stand in groups at the quarry of Rano Raraku, some partially buried in the slopes, their massive heads emerging from the earth as though growing from it. They lie abandoned on the roads that lead from the quarry to the coast, some face down, some tilted to the side, some broken. The quarry is where they began. Rano Raraku is a volcanic crater on the southeast of the island, and its walls are composed of a compressed volcanic ash called tuff, which is dense enough to be carved but soft enough to be worked with stone tools. The carvers of Rapa Nui discovered this material and made it the basis of a sculptural tradition that lasted for centuries. Working with basalt stone chisels, they carved moai from the living rock of the crater wall, shaping the front and sides of the figure while it remained attached to the rock at the back, then completing the back surface and separating the statue from the quarry wall in a final act of release. The moai are not simple figures. They are stylized but specific, with distinctive features, the long ears that reflect the practice of ear extension through heavy earrings that was practiced by the high-status individuals who were the subjects of the carving, the strong nose and defined chin, the compressed torso and short arms, the hands placed across the abdomen with an emphasis on the long fingers. Some Moai are larger and some smaller, but all share the same basic morphology, the same aesthetic vocabulary, because they are all portraits of the same kind of being, an ancestor, a person of power and status, rendered in stone as a permanent presence among the living. Each Moai was commissioned by a clan, a lineage group that traced its descent from specific ancestors, and each Moai stood on the ahu of that clan as an embodiment of ancestral authority. The ahu themselves were burial platforms, built on and above the bones of the dead, so that the Moai stood literally at the meeting point between the living and the dead, channeling the power of the ancestors into the world of the living. The islanders oriented their Moai with their backs to the sea, their faces toward the community, watching over the people they protected, presiding over the agricultural plots and the village sites that stretched out below them toward the interior of the island. This system of ancestral authority expressed through monumental stone figures was not unique to Rapa Nui. It is a Pacific cultural tradition that appears in various forms across Polynesia, and it connects the Rapa Nui Moai to the ancestor cult practices of societies from Hawaii to New Zealand, from the Marquesas to Samoa. What makes Rapa Nui distinctive is the scale to which this tradition was taken and the specific form it assumed on this tiny, isolated, resource-constrained island, where the competition for status between clans translated into a competition to build the most impressive, the tallest, the most elaborately finished Moai. The question that has haunted study of the Moai since Europeans first encountered them is not how they were carved, but how they were moved. From the quarry to the coastal ahu, some Moai were transported several miles across the island's volcanic landscape, without the benefit of wheeled vehicles, draft animals, or any of the other mechanical advantages that seem to make such transportation thinkable. The largest Moai weigh more than 80 tons. They are 12, 15, 20 feet tall. Moving them seemed to demand an explanation, and the explanation that dominated popular understanding for decades was that the people of Rapa Nui had used the island's vast forests as timber for rollers, levering the massive stones along log ramps and cradles, a technique that required enormous quantities of wood and that could help explain the deforestation. This explanation has been largely abandoned in light of experimental archaeology. Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo, working with a team that included Rapa Nui community members, conducted a series of experiments in 2012 with a replica Moai weighing several tons, testing the hypothesis that the Moai could be transported in the upright position using a system of ropes manipulated by teams on either side and at the rear of the statue. The upright position allows the Moai to be rocked forward using the curvature of its base, shifting weight from side to side in a controlled walking motion, exactly as a very heavy object might be walked across a floor. Applying this technique with 3 teams of workers, one on each side and one controlling a rope attached to the rear, the team found that a small number of people could move a statue of significant weight across a flat surface at a reasonable pace, with the statue appearing, to any observer watching from a distance, to be walking. Walking. This is precisely what the oral tradition of Rapa Nui has always described. The Moai, in Rapa Nui tradition, walked to their ahu. The phrase used in traditional accounts, which missionaries and ethnographers recorded from the 19th century onward, can be translated as, "the statues walked," and generations of Western scholars dismissed this as myth, as a poetic description of a transportation process they could not visualize, or as a legend that had grown up to explain ruins that the islanders themselves could no longer account for. Hunt and Lipo's experiments confirmed that it was not myth at all. It was technical instruction, encoded in the most memorable form available to a culture without writing, a story about things that seemed impossible. The roads leading away from Ranoraraku across the island, which have long been interpreted as routes, along which the Moai were transported horizontally on wooden sledges, look different when understood as pathways designed for the upright walking technique. The roads are raised in the center, with drainage channels on either side, a design that makes little sense for horizontal transportation, but that makes excellent sense for upright walking, where the elevated central pathway would give the base of the Moai the slight advantage in elevation needed for the rocking motion, while the drainage channels would prevent the path from becoming muddy and slippery underfoot. The roads, examined through this lens, are infrastructure designed specifically for the technique that the oral tradition describes and that the experimental archaeology has now confirmed. The construction of the Moai, their transport to the coast, and their erection on the Ahu represents an enormous collective enterprise, one that has always seemed to require a larger and more complex social organization than a population of a few thousand people could easily sustain. But the question of social complexity is separate from the question of social stability. A small population that is well organized, that has a shared system of values and a functioning hierarchy of authority, can accomplish extraordinary things, and the Moai building tradition of Rapa Nui lasted for several centuries, from around 1100 CE to approximately 1600 CE, suggesting not a culture in crisis, but a culture with enough stability and surplus capacity to invest in monumental production over many generations. At some point before European contact, the Moai building tradition ended. The quarry was abandoned, with nearly 400 statues in various stages of completion still there, some fully carved but never moved from the quarry walls, some partially finished, some merely sketched in the volcanic tuff, the outlines of figures that would never be completed. The reason for the ending of the tradition is not known with certainty, but the evidence suggests a transformation in the social and religious system of Rapa Nui rather than a catastrophic collapse. The Birdman cult, which became the dominant religious tradition on the island in the later centuries before European contact, represented a different kind of power and authority from the ancestral power of the Moai system, and the transition between the two may have rendered the Moai tradition obsolete rather than making it impossible. The Moai were also, at some point, all toppled. By the time the first decades of the 19th century had passed, every Moai that had been standing on its Ahu had been pulled down. The conventional interpretation of this toppling, embedded in the ecocide narrative, was that the statue wars of a collapsing civilization had led rival clans to destroy each other's most valued property, the manifestations of their ancestors' power. The reality appears to be considerably more complex. Moai toppling in Rapa Nui culture had ritual dimensions as well as hostile ones. An Ahu whose Moai had been toppled was not necessarily a defeated one. It might be an Ahu whose community had dispersed, or whose ritual relationship to the ancestors it embodied had been transformed by the cataclysm of European contact. And European contact, it now appears, was indeed a cataclysm, though not the kind of internal collapse that Diamond described. It was something done to the Rapa Nui people, not something they did to themselves. Contact with European ships was, for most of the 18th century, intermittent and not immediately devastating. Jacob Roggevin stayed only briefly. A Spanish expedition in 1770 made more extended contact and formally claimed the island for Spain, an annexation that had no practical effect and was quickly forgotten by the Spanish administration that theoretically owned it. Captain James Cook arrived in 1774 on his second Pacific voyage and spent several days on the island, noting with evident compassion the poverty and thinness of the people. But his description of poverty may reflect his own European standards of what a functioning society should look like, more than it reflects an actual crisis in Rapa Nui society. Cook's naturalist, Johann Reinhold Forster, provided detailed observations that suggested a small but functioning population. The first half of the 19th century brought increasing contact as the Pacific became more heavily traversed by European and American shipping, and with that contact came disease. The common diseases of Europe and America, against which Rapa Nui people had no immunity, periodically devastated the island's population in the decades after sustained contact began. But even this was not the final catastrophe. The final catastrophe had a specific name, a specific date, and a specific perpetrator. In December of 1862, a fleet of Peruvian slave ships arrived at Rapa Nui. Slavers had been raiding Pacific islands for years, taking indigenous people as forced labor for the mines and plantations, and, increasingly, the guano islands of the Peruvian coast, where the enormous deposits of bird excrement that had accumulated over centuries were being harvested by the thousands of tons for use as agricultural fertilizer. The guano harvest was one of the most miserable forms of labor that the 19th century had devised, and it required a constant supply of new workers because the old ones died so rapidly. The Peruvian blackbirders, as they were called, had developed a range of techniques for acquiring this labor. They lured people onto their ships with promises of gifts or trade. They staged mock theatrical spectacles on deck to attract curious onlookers who could then be seized. And when the situation allowed, they simply went ashore and took people by force. At Rapa Nui, in December of 1862, they did all of these things, and they did them repeatedly across a series of raids that over the following weeks took approximately 1,500 people from an island whose total population at the time was perhaps 3,000. Think about what those numbers mean. In a matter of weeks, half the island's population was taken, but the loss was not random. The slavers were selective in ways that would prove devastating to Rapa Nui culture. They took the young and the strong, because weak workers were not worth the cost of transport. They took the men of authority, the ariki, the hereditary chiefs, who carried the knowledge and the power of Rapa Nui's social system. And they took the tangata rongorongo, the people who could read the script. Rongorongo. The word means something like chanting or recitation, and it is the name given both to the system of writing used by the Rapa Nui people and to the wooden tablets on which that writing was inscribed. Rongorongo is one of only a handful of writing systems in human history that appear to have been independently invented, systems that did not develop from or in imitation of any other writing tradition, but that arose from the specific intellectual and cultural needs of the people who created them. Most scholars believe Rongorongo developed on Rapa Nui itself, possibly in the early 18th century, possibly in response to the sight of European documents during Spanish contact in 1770, possibly much earlier from older traditions of marking and symbolic communication. The tablets on which Rongorongo is written are small wooden objects, typically made from driftwood, because the island has no large native trees that would provide suitable timber, carved in a distinctive style called reverse boustrophodon. The reader begins at the bottom left of the tablet, reads across to the right, then rotates the tablet 180 degrees and reads the next line from left to right again, so that each successive line is read upside down relative to the previous one. The signs themselves are small, intricately carved, representing a variety of forms, including human figures, animals, plants, and geometric shapes, arranged in sequences that appear to follow rules, to have structure, to mean something. Only about 25 tablets and other objects bearing Rongorongo survive, scattered across museums and collections in several countries. No one has definitively deciphered them. Scholars can identify some signs, can recognize some structural patterns, can argue for possible interpretations of certain sequences. But the core meaning of Rongorongo remains inaccessible, protected by the same isolation that protected Rapa Nui itself for centuries from the wider world, and now protected by a different kind of isolation, the absence of the people who could read it. The Tangata Rongorongo, the knowledge keepers, were taken in the slave raids of 1862. The chiefs, who might have overseen the training of new readers, were taken. The social structure that supported the transmission of reading knowledge from one generation to the next was dismembered in those December weeks when the slave ships worked their way around the island's coast. Of the approximately 1,500 people taken to the Guano Islands of Peru, only about 100 survived the conditions there long enough to be repatriated, and their repatriation came only after sustained international pressure, particularly from Bishop Tepano Jausen of Tahiti, who intervened with the Peruvian government through French diplomatic channels. Those 100 survivors, brought back to Rapa Nui in 1863, were already dying. They brought measles and smallpox back to an island population that had no immunity to either disease, and the epidemic that followed killed most of the people who had not been taken in the raids. The population of Rapa Nui, which had been measured in the thousands, was reduced within 2 years to a few hundred people. And it was not over. In 1864, the first Catholic missionaries arrived, led by Father Eugène Hérault, and began the work of converting the remaining population to Christianity, a process that involved the suppression of traditional religious practices and the destruction or confiscation of traditional cultural objects, including rongorongo tablets. In 1868, a French adventurer and merchant named Jean-Baptiste du Trou-Bornier arrived and began purchasing land. By 1871, he had acquired most of the island, converted it to a sheep ranch, and reduced the Rapa Nui people to a dependent workforce on what had been their own land. Many left, choosing to accompany the departing missionaries to Tahiti and the Gambier Islands, preferring voluntary exile to the conditions du Trou-Bornier imposed. In 1877, a census was taken. The population of Rapa Nui was 111 people. 111 people remained of a civilization that had carved the Moai, that had developed an independent writing system, that had built the greatest works of monumental art in the Pacific. The island was annexed by Chile in 1888, formally incorporated into a republic that had no more understanding of Rapa Nui culture or history than the Peruvian slavers who had preceded it. This is the real story of what happened to Rapa Nui. Not ecocide, not self-destruction, not a civilization too foolish to see that it was sawing off its own branch. A civilization that developed remarkable technologies of agriculture and monumental construction and symbolic communication on the most remote inhabited island on Earth, that was building, trading, and sustaining a stable population when the first Europeans arrived, and that was then dismembered with extraordinary efficiency by the mechanisms of colonial extraction, disease, slavery, dispossession, and cultural destruction. Jared Diamond's ecocide narrative was not invented from nothing. It drew on real evidence of deforestation, real evidence of ecological change, real evidence of the abandonment of the Moai building tradition. But it assembled that evidence into a story that located the cause of the collapse inside Rapa Nui, in the choices and failures of the Rapa Nui people themselves, rather than in what was done to them from outside. This was not a neutral interpretive choice. It was a story that, however unintentionally, transferred moral responsibility from the actors of colonial exploitation onto their victims, converting a story about what was done to a people into a story about what they did to themselves. The revision of that story is not merely an academic debate about the correct interpretation of archaeological evidence. It is a matter of moral record. The Rapa Nui people deserve to have their actual history told, the history of what they built and how they sustained themselves and what was taken from them. That history is more complex and ultimately more disturbing than the ecocide myth, not because it involves ecological destruction, but because it involves deliberate human cruelty on a scale that came close to erasing an entire culture in less than 20 years. The Rongorongo tablets that survived, scattered across the museums and private collections of Europe and the Americas, hold inscriptions that no living person can read with certainty. What do they say? What knowledge did the Tangata Rongorongo carry in those signs? Were they astronomical records, genealogies, ritual chants, histories of the island and its people, accounts of the Moai, and what they meant? Whatever they contain, the content has been inaccessible for more than a century and a half, ever since the people who could interpret it were taken away on the slave ships of 1862 and 1863. The analogy that scholars sometimes make is with the linear A script of the Minoan civilization of ancient Crete, which also remains undeciphered because the language it encodes is not known, or with the Indus Valley script of the ancient cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, which also waits for the key that would make it readable. But there is a difference. Those scripts were lost gradually, their speakers absorbed by other cultures over centuries, the knowledge of how to read them fading through natural cultural change. Rongorongo was lost in a matter of months, in the specific catastrophe of the slave raids, with identifiable perpetrators and identifiable victims, a loss that was immediate, total, and unnecessary. Some of the surviving Rongorongo tablets are held at major institutions: the Vatican Library, the Berlin Ethnological Museum, the Bishop Museum in Honolulu, the British Museum in London. Scholars continue to study them, continue to apply computational methods and comparative analysis and every available tool of linguistic and archaeological investigation to the project of understanding what they say. Partial progress has been made. Certain signs have been tentatively identified. Certain sequences have been interpreted as possibly relating to lunar or agricultural calendars. But the full text of Rongorongo, whatever story it tells about Rapa Nui and its people, has not been recovered and may never be. The Moai are similarly distributed around the world. When European ships called at Rapa Nui in the 19th century, they routinely took Moai as curiosities, as spectacular objects to carry home and display as evidence of the wonders of the Pacific and the capacity of non-European peoples to produce monumental art. The British warship HMS Topaz called at the island in 1868 and took two significant Moai, Hoa Hakananaya, whose name means stolen or hidden friend, and Moai Hava. Hoa Hakananaya was transported to London and presented to Queen Victoria, who donated it to the British Museum, where it has been on display ever since. The Rapa Nui people have been asking for the return of Hoa Hakananaya and of other Moai held in collections around the world for decades. Their requests have been made through formal diplomatic channels, through personal appeals by elected leaders of the Rapa Nui Parliament, through cultural missions and international advocacy. The British Museum's response has been what it is to most repatriation requests: that the object is better preserved in London, that it is more widely accessible to the world's visitors in a major international museum, that the legal frameworks of British museum collections make it impossible to return objects even if the museum wished to do so. In 2022, a delegation of Rapa Nui officials met with museum leadership in London. The governor of Easter Island, who was then Maria Elena Hotus, told the museum representatives something that has been at the center of the Rapa Nui position on repatriation since the conversation about it began. She said that Hoa Hakananaya should be brought home. She said that the statue was a member of their community, an ancestor, a person in the Rapa Nui understanding of the world. She said that keeping him in London was not conservation but separation, and that the Rapa Nui people should be trusted to care for their own. The British Museum has not returned Hoa Hakananaya. The Rapa Nui people continue to ask. The island today is a different place from the bare volcanic rock that Roggeveen described in 1722, and yet also the same in the essential ways. The population has recovered, slowly, over the century and a half since the Nadir of 1877, to approximately 7,000 people today, of whom perhaps half are ethnically Rapa Nui. There are hotels and flights from Santiago and Tahiti, and a tourist economy that has made Rapa Nui a destination for hundreds of thousands of visitors who come to see the Moai. The Moai themselves have been re-erected on some of the coastal Ahu by archaeological teams working with the Rapa Nui community, and they stand again as they stood when Roggeveen arrived, facing inland over the grassland and the stone-mulched gardens, presiding over an island that is finding its way back to itself. The Rapa Nui people are conducting this recovery on their own terms, with a growing political consciousness and a legal framework that gives them, since 2019, a measure of autonomy over their island that they did not have before. The law, passed by the Chilean parliament in that year, gave the Rapa Nui people control over land ownership on the island and restricted the ability of non-Rapa Nui people to purchase property there, a step toward self-determination that the community had been seeking for decades. But the larger recovery is cultural, and it depends on things that cannot simply be legislated into existence. The Rongo cannot be recovered by a parliamentary vote. The knowledge that was taken from the island in 1862 cannot be returned. What can be returned, what the Rapa Nui people are insisting be returned, are the objects that carry that knowledge in physical form, the tablets that no one can read, the moai that embody the ancestors, the cultural heritage that was extracted from a people who had already been reduced to 111 souls and who were not in a position to refuse. The conventional story of Easter Island, the story that Jared Diamond told and that millions of people learned in school and from popular books and television documentaries, was a story about self-destruction, about a people who could not stop themselves from consuming their own environment until there was nothing left to consume. It was a story, ultimately, about helplessness in the face of one's own worst impulses, and it was meant as a warning to modern industrial civilization about the same kind of helplessness. The true story of Easter Island is not about helplessness. It is about the opposite of helplessness. It is about a people who developed extraordinary capacities for survival on one of the most challenging inhabited places on Earth, who built a culture of astonishing richness and complexity in conditions that would have discouraged most civilizations, who sustained themselves and their traditions for centuries in near-complete isolation from the rest of the human world. And when that isolation was broken, when the ships arrived, they were not destroyed by their own failures, but by the specific and intentional cruelty of others, by slavers who looked at a functioning civilization and saw only labor, by missionaries who looked at a living culture and saw only ignorance, by colonizers who looked at an inhabited island and saw only land. 111 people in 1877, 7,000 people today. The ancestors who were taken are not in the quarry at Rano Raraku or on the Ahu platforms along the coast. They are in museum storage rooms and display cases in London and Berlin and New York and Washington. And the people who are still on the island, the descendants of those 111 survivors, have been saying the same thing for years, in diplomatic meetings and formal requests and occasional acts of direct protest. Our ancestors were taken. Give them back. The Moai, in Rapa Nui understanding, are not objects. They are people. They watch over the communities they were made to protect. They maintain their relationships with the living across the boundary of death. A Moai in a museum display case in London, is not preserved. It is separated from the community it belongs to, prevented from doing the thing it was made to do, kept from the island that is its home and the people who are its family. Hoa Hakananaya, the stolen or hidden friend, stands in a glass case in the British Museum. His name, which the Rapa Nui gave him before he was taken, is its own form of testimony. The friend who was hidden, the ancestor who was taken, the tie between the living and the dead that was severed by the act of removal. The Rapa Nui people are still speaking. They are still naming what was done to them. They are still asking for what was taken to be returned. And the Moai are still waiting, in the museums and the display cases of the world, in the wrong place, separated from the community they were made to watch over, patiently enduring a distance that the people who made them never intended, and the people who are descended from them have never accepted. The island is there, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, more remote than anywhere else on Earth, and its people are there, and they are not finished. The story the ecocide narrative told about Easter Island was a story about an ending. The actual history of Rapa Nui is a story about survival, and about the people who chose to survive it, and about what they are still, quietly and persistently, and with growing force, demanding that the record be corrected, that the truth be told, and that what was taken be given back. Their ancestors never disappeared. They were taken. And the Rapa Nui people, 7,000 of them, are still here to say so. The specific work that Hunt and Lipo and their colleagues have done to revise the Easter Island narrative deserves more detailed attention than a summary account provides, because the methodology of that revision is as significant as the conclusions it reached. Archaeological evidence is always interpreted within a theoretical framework, and the frameworks that scholars bring to evidence shape what they see in it. The ecocide narrative that Diamond popularized was built on a specific interpretive framework that included assumptions about the relationship between population size and environmental impact, about the cognitive capacity of pre-industrial peoples to understand and manage their environments, and about the kinds of evidence that counting for what when assessing the health or decline of a society. Hunt began working on Rapa Nui in the 1990s, initially with traditional goals of understanding the island's settlement history and the development of its culture. The evidence he and his colleagues gathered through systematic excavation of sites across the island began to reveal a picture that did not match the existing narrative at multiple points simultaneously, and the divergences between what the evidence showed and what the dominant theory predicted were large enough to require a fundamental rethinking rather than incremental revision. The population question was central. Archaeological surveys of settlement sites, the identification and mapping of the remains of houses and storage facilities and cooking areas and other traces of habitation suggested a maximum population considerably smaller than Diamond's estimates. Hunt's analysis, using established methods of estimating population from the density and size of habitation remains, pointed toward a figure in the range of 2,000 to 3,000 as the likely maximum population of Rapa Nui at any point in its history. This was not a post-collapse remnant. It was the actual scale of the society, and it changed everything about how the society's relationship to its environment should be understood. A population of 3,000 people living on an island of 63 square miles has a specific ecological footprint. It requires a specific amount of food, water, and fuel. It produces a specific amount of agricultural demand and waste, and it requires, for the building and maintenance of the Moai tradition, a specific amount of labor that is substantially less than the labor required by a population of 15,000 or 20,000. 3,000 people, well organized and well fed, could have built the Moai of Rapa Nui, They would not have needed to consume the entire forest to do it. The dating evidence also revised the timeline in important ways. Earlier scholarship had assumed that Rapa Nui was settled early, perhaps as early as 400 CE, giving the population more than 1,000 years to grow to a large size and to develop the cultural traditions that the Moai represent. Hunt's radiocarbon dating of the earliest settlement evidence pointed toward a significantly later date, around 1200 CE, which compressed the timeline and made the larger population estimates even less plausible. If settlement was not until 1200 CE, there simply was not enough time for the population to grow from a small founding group to the 15 or 20,000 that Diamond's version required. The forest question was addressed through pollen core analysis, the examination of sediment cores from the island's lake beds, which preserve a record of the vegetation that surrounded them across the centuries. The pollen record confirmed that the palm forest had declined, and that this decline was real and substantial. But the timing and the pattern of the decline, when examined carefully, were not consistent with the simple story of human cutting. The decline began before the period of most intensive Moai building, which should have been the period of greatest timber demand if the link between Moai construction and forest clearance were direct. And the decline was most consistent with the pattern of seed predation that a large rat population would produce, where new growth is prevented while existing trees die at their natural rate. The Pacific rat's presence on the island was confirmed by the discovery of rat-gnawed palm nuts in sediment deposits, some of them dating from early in the settlement period, exactly when the rat population explosion would be expected to begin. The nuts, with their characteristic gnaw marks, provided direct physical evidence of the mechanism that Hunt and his colleagues proposed, not human cutting as the primary cause of deforestation, but rat predation on the seeds and nuts that would have produced the next generation of trees. This is a crucial distinction. If the deforestation was caused primarily by humans cutting trees, it was potentially preventable, a rational decision to stop cutting, an understanding that the resource was finite. If it was caused primarily by rats consuming the seeds, it was in some ways inevitable once the rats were established, because preventing rat reproduction to a degree that would allow forest regeneration would have required either the elimination of the rats, which Rapa Nui people had no known technology to accomplish at scale, or a miraculous collapse of the rat population from another cause. The rats ate the seeds. The forest died. This was not a choice. It was an ecological cascade set in motion by the arrival of the founding settlement. The implications for the moral of the story are significant. Diamond used Easter Island as an example of the failure of a society to respond rationally to the environmental consequences of its own behavior, a failure he traced to a combination of cultural commitment to status competition through Moai building and cognitive limitations that prevented the islanders from understanding the long-term consequences of their actions. If the deforestation was primarily driven by rats rather than by human cutting, this moral evaporates. The Rapa Nui people did not fail to respond to the environmental consequences of their behavior. They were managing a difficult ecological situation caused by the unintended introduction of a highly destructive pest, with the considerable ingenuity of the rock garden agriculture system and the other adaptive strategies that Hunt and his colleagues identified. The political dimensions of the two narratives are worth pausing on, because they are not accidental. The ecocide narrative, in which a civilization destroys itself through environmental mismanagement, serves a specific rhetorical function in contemporary debates about environmental policy. It says that even sophisticated, culturally rich, architecturally accomplished civilizations can make the mistake of consuming their own environmental foundations, and that this is a universal human tendency. It makes the environmental crisis a human nature problem rather than a political economy problem, which is convenient for those who prefer to discuss environmental challenges in terms of individual behavior rather than in terms of the specific economic and political systems that produce environmental destruction. The correct narrative, in which a civilization was sustainable and functioning until it was devastated by the specific practices of colonial slavery and extraction, says something quite different. It identifies specific perpetrators. It identifies specific mechanisms. It says that the destruction of the Rapa Nui civilization was not an inevitability arising from human nature, but a consequence of specific choices made by specific people in specific institutions, choices that could have been made differently, and that were, in fact, made differently once the international pressure organized by Bishop Jausen and others forced the Peruvian government to end the slave raids and repatriate what survivors remained. This distinction matters not just as a historical correction, but as a political statement about how environmental and cultural destruction happens and who is responsible for it. The Rapa Nui people understand this very well, which is why their contemporary advocacy for autonomy, for repatriation of cultural objects, and for recognition of what was done to them is conducted with such clarity about the difference between what happened by their own agency and what was done to them without their consent. The Rongo Rongo script sits at the intersection of these questions about agency and loss in a particularly poignant way. Here is a writing system, independently invented, that encoded something about Rapa Nui culture and knowledge, something that the people who created it considered worth recording in permanent form on carefully carved wooden tablets. The tablets survived. The knowledge that would allow them to be read did not survive the slave raids of 1862. We have the messages but not the code. We have the books but not the language. The efforts to decipher Rongo Rongo have continued for over a century, and they have produced a body of scholarship that is impressive in its rigor and frustrating in its inconclusiveness. The identification of the writing system was made in the 1860s and 1870s by missionaries and scholars who realized, when they saw the tablets, that they were looking at something systematic and deliberate, not decorative carving, but writing. The Tahitian bishop, Tepano Jausen, was one of the first to recognize this, and he attempted to find someone who could read the tablets, which led him to a Rapa Nui man named Metoro Tawa Ure, who claimed to be able to interpret them. The account that Metoro gave Jausen was recorded, but has proven difficult to reconcile with the signs on the tablets, and most scholars doubt that Metoro had genuine reading knowledge rather than a general familiarity with the objects and their cultural context. Various approaches to decipherment have been attempted in the years since. Structural analysis of the signs has identified patterns. Certain signs appear more frequently than others. Certain sign combinations occur more often than chance would predict. The signs are arranged in sequences that follow consistent internal rules. Some researchers have proposed that Rongo Rongo is a mnemonic device rather than a true writing system, a set of visual prompts that helped a trained reader remember a text they had memorized rather than a system capable of encoding previously unrecorded text. Others have argued for genuine phonetic or logographic content. The current scholarly consensus, to the extent that there is one, is that Rongo Rongo is a partly phonetic, partly logographic writing system of genuine complexity, capable of encoding real linguistic content, and that it cannot be read. A comparison with Linear A, the undeciphered script of the Minoan civilization of Bronze Age Crete, is often made and is partially apt. Both are genuine writing systems whose language is unknown to modern scholarship. Both have survived in a limited number of inscriptions. Both wait for the bilingual text or the scholarly breakthrough that might provide the key to decipherment. But the comparison also highlights what is unique about Rongorongo. It was being read by living people within the last 2 centuries. The knowledge of how to read it is not lost to time and cultural change in the way that the knowledge of how to read linear A is lost. It was taken, suddenly and deliberately, by people who had no interest in what the tablets said, and only an interest in what the people who could read them could produce as labor. This specific, traumatic quality of the loss distinguishes the situation of Rongorongo from most other undeciphered scripts. With most undeciphered scripts, we say the knowledge was lost over time. With Rongorongo, we know what happened to the knowledge. We know when it was taken, and how, and by whom. The tablets in the museums are not archaeological mysteries in the way that linear A is a mystery. They are stolen property, whose interpretation was destroyed at the moment of its taking. The repatriation debate around the Moai is similarly specific in its moral character. The Moai that were taken from Rapa Nui in the 19th century were not acquired through any process that resembled consent or fair exchange. They were taken from a people who had been decimated by slave raids and disease, who had no functioning governmental or legal authority capable of negotiating on their behalf, who were being actively dispossessed of their land and their cultural autonomy by the very same colonial processes that had brought the slave ships and the missionaries. The British Museum's possession of Hoa Hakananaya is not a neutral historical fact. It is the end state of a specific colonial transaction conducted under conditions of extreme inequality and cultural destruction. The Rapa Nui people's case for repatriation rests not only on the specific moral argument about the conditions under which the Moai were taken, but on a deeper argument about what the Moai are and what their removal means. In Rapa Nui cosmology, which has been sustained in attenuated form through the catastrophes of the 19th century and the cultural suppression that followed, the Moai are not artifacts, they are ancestors. The presence of ancestors on the land they were made to watch over is not a matter of symbolic preference. It is a matter of cosmological necessity, of the proper functioning of the relationship between the living and the dead that the Moai embody. When Hoa Hakananaya was brought to London in 1869, the carving on his back was only partially understood by the Europeans who took him. The back of the statue bears some of the most elaborate and significant Rongorongo inscriptions known, as well as carvings relating to the birdman cult that was the dominant religious tradition of the final centuries of independent Rapa Nui culture. This carving makes Hoa Hakananaya not merely a Moai, but a particularly significant carrier of Rapa Nui knowledge and belief, a stone record of aspects of the culture that are only partially preserved in other forms. His absence from Rapa Nui is therefore doubly felt. It is the absence of an ancestor and the absence of a cultural document. The British Museum has said that it cannot legally return Hoa Hakananaya because the British Museum Act of 1963 prohibits the museum from permanently transferring objects from its collection except in very limited circumstances. This is a real constraint, and it is one that the museum has cited in response to repatriation requests from multiple countries and communities for multiple objects. But it is worth noting that the legal framework preventing repatriation was created by the British government, that it could be changed by the British government, and that the question of whether it should be changed is a political question, not merely a legal one. The Rapa Nui community is not alone in pressing this question. The broader movement for the repatriation of cultural objects removed during the colonial period has been gathering force across the world for decades, and it has produced specific results. Human remains taken from indigenous communities by ethnologists and medical researchers in the 19th and early 20th centuries have been returned. Sacred objects removed from Native American communities have been repatriated under United States federal law. Specific objects of particular cultural significance have been returned to their communities of origin in a variety of contexts. The principle that cultural property belongs to its community of origin rather than to whoever has physical possession of it is gaining ground in international law and in museum practice, however slowly. The Moai of Rapa Nui are particularly clear cases for repatriation because the community of origin still exists, is identifiable, has a functioning political structure capable of negotiating for and accepting returns, and has demonstrated both the desire for the object's return and the capacity to care for them. The island has a museum, the Museo Antropológico Padre Sebastián Englert, which manages the cultural heritage of Rapa Nui on Gwenton Harris, maintained and researched the island's archaeological record for decades. The claim that repatriated Moai would be less well cared for on Rapa Nui than in the British Museum is not supported by any evidence. It reflects an assumption about the relative institutional capacity of a Chilean island community and a London institution that is not founded in fact. The Rapa Nui people have proposed various arrangements for the return of Hoa Hakananaya, including long-term loans that would allow for temporary return while legal questions were addressed, and they have consistently expressed willingness to work with the museum on terms that reflected genuine partnership rather than unilateral return. The British Museum's responses have been cautious, and the discussions have not produced agreement. The political context has shifted in recent years. The Chilean government has become more active in supporting Rapa Nui's repatriation claims, and international pressure on European museums over colonial-era acquisitions has increased significantly. The broader debate about colonial returns, accelerated by the discussions around the Parthenon marbles from Greece and the Benin bronzes from Nigeria, has changed the environment in which the Rapa Nui case is being made. The question is not whether the arguments for repatriation are valid. They clearly are. The question is whether the political will to act on those arguments exists in the institutions that currently hold the objects. The larger story of Rapa Nui, the story that the revised archaeological understanding of the island now allows to be told, is a story about the meeting of two very different understandings of the world, one rooted in relationships and continuity and the responsibility of the living toward the ancestors who watch over them, the other rooted in extraction and acquisition and the assumption that the possessions of those with less power are available to those with more. The Rapa Nui civilization did not fail. It was not destroyed by its own inability to manage its environment or its own irrational competition for a status. It was disrupted by the arrival of Europeans who brought disease, and it was then devastated by slavers who wanted its labor, and it was then dispossessed by colonists who wanted its land, and it has been fighting ever since for the recognition of what happened to it and for the return of what was taken. The Moai that still stand on Rapa Nui, re-erected on their ahu by the patient work of archaeologists and community members, face inland over the grassland. They stand as they always stood, watching over a community that has survived. The rock garden plots, some of them still traceable in the landscape, speak to the ingenuity of a people who found a way to live on a difficult island. The Rongorongo tablets, in their museum cases around the world, carry inscriptions that no one can read, a silence that speaks more loudly than most of the texts that can be decoded. The island has 7,000 people living on it now. They are building a culture that honors what survived and acknowledges what was lost. They are making music and art and political arguments. They are raising children who will know the island's actual history, not the myth of self-destruction, but the truth of what was done to them and what their ancestors managed to preserve despite everything that was done to them. The Moai of Rapa Nui were made to watch over the living, to maintain the relationship between the ancestors and the community they belong to. The ones in the museums are not fulfilling that function. They are separated from their community by 10,000 miles and a century and a half of legal argument about who owns what and what can be moved and what cannot. In the Rapa Nui understanding of things, they are not well. They are away from where they should be. They are waiting. The Rapa Nui people say this plainly and without apology. Their ancestors never disappeared. They were taken. The statues never fell. They were pushed, and the writing on the tablets is not lost. It was silenced by a specific people in a specific historical moment for specific reasons that have nothing to do with the legitimate interests of human knowledge or the proper stewardship of human heritage. The most remote inhabited island on Earth sits in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, surrounded by more water than any other inhabited place, and its people are not silent. They are speaking, in English and Spanish and Rapa Nui, in diplomatic meetings and public demonstrations, and documentary films and legal submissions, about what happened and what they want. They want Hoa Hakananaya home. They want the tablets read, or acknowledged as unreadable because the readers were taken. They want the history corrected. And they are still here, which is the most remarkable thing of all, given everything that was done to reduce that possibility to nothing. 111 people in 1877, 7,000 people now. The statues that were always ancestors, the script that encodes something we cannot read, the rock gardens that sustained a civilization on the most challenging inhabited place on Earth. The story of Rapa Nui is not a story about failure. It is a story about what human beings can build in the most extreme conditions of isolation and constraint, and about what other human beings can destroy in the name of profit and empire, and about what survives the destruction and what does not, and about the people who live in the aftermath and insist on the truth of what happened. The statues are watching. They are still watching. And the people they were made to protect are still there. The specific relationship between the Rapa Nui people and the ocean that surrounds them is one of the elements of their culture and history that the conventional ecocide narrative consistently understated. Polynesian navigation is one of the great intellectual and practical achievements in human history, the product of a maritime tradition that, over thousands of years and thousands of miles, moved human populations across the entire Pacific Ocean, using sailing craft and navigational knowledge sophisticated enough to make intentional, repeated voyages between islands separated by hundreds of miles of open water. The people who arrived at Rapa Nui had sailed there. They had come, most likely, from eastern Polynesia, possibly from the Marquesas Islands, nearly 2,000 miles to the northwest, and they had made that voyage in double-hulled canoes, using the stars, the ocean swell patterns, the flight of birds, the color of the water, and the accumulated traditional knowledge of a maritime civilization that was, in its own domain, as technically advanced as any culture on Earth. When Europeans first began exploring the Pacific in any systematic way in the 16th and 17th centuries, they found island communities distributed across millions of square miles of ocean, connected by a tradition of navigation that they found difficult to comprehend and initially dismissed as accidental. It was not accidental. The settlement of the Pacific was deliberate, systematic, and extraordinarily accomplished, and the settlement of Rapa Nui, the most remote inhabited island on Earth, was its furthest expression. Getting to Rapa Nui required crossing more open ocean than any other Pacific settlement, navigating to a target that offers no advance warning of its presence, no birds flying far enough ahead to signal land, no clouds forming over mountains that can be seen from the horizon. To find Rapa Nui, you have to know where you are going, and you have to be extraordinarily skilled at getting there. The founding settlers of Rapa Nui brought that knowledge with them. They also brought the social structures, the agricultural knowledge, and the cultural traditions of Eastern Polynesia, adapted in the centuries after settlement to the specific conditions of their isolated home. The Moai tradition, which has parallels in various forms of ancestor commemoration across Polynesia, took its specific and extraordinary form on Rapa Nui, partly because the island's resources, particularly the volcanic tuff of Ranoraraku, made stone carving on a large scale possible, and partly because the island's isolation meant that the tradition developed without the external influences that would have modified it elsewhere. The specific choice to make the Moai as large as they are, and to invest the enormous collective labor in their construction and transportation that the tradition required, reflects something about the social dynamics of a small, isolated population. When groups of people compete for status, the scale of competition tends to escalate over time, as each successive demonstration of wealth or power raises the bar for the next. On Rapa Nui, the Moai building competition between clans operated in this way, with Moai becoming progressively larger and more elaborate across the centuries of the tradition's development. The largest Moai, some of them never completed and never transported from the quarry, represent the terminal phase of this escalation, a scale that perhaps exceeded what the available social organization could actually achieve in transportation and erection. This escalation is not evidence of irrationality or self-destruction. It is evidence of a specific social dynamic that appears in many forms in human cultures, the competitive display of status that functions to maintain hierarchies, resolve conflicts without violence, then signal to potential partners and rivals the resources and capabilities available to one's group. The Moai competition was a specific, culturally elaborated form of this universal human dynamic, and the archaeological record of its development shows the logic of a system that was, for several centuries, working as intended, maintaining social order and cultural coherence in a population that lived in close proximity without any external diplomatic or legal authority to mediate conflicts. The social order that the Moai system maintained was based on lineage and ancestry, the fundamental Polynesian principle that authority derives from one's connection to powerful ancestors, and that the strength of that connection, demonstrated through ritual and through the maintenance of appropriate relationships with the ancestral world, legitimates political leadership. Each clan's ahu and its associated Moai were the material expression of that clan's ancestral claims, the physical embodiment of the argument that we are here, we have always been here, our ancestors watch over us, and our right to this land and these resources flows from them. When the Moai were toppled, the toppling disrupted this system of ancestral authority in a way that went beyond mere property destruction. An upright Moai is an ancestor present and active, maintaining the connection between the clan and its ancestral foundation. A toppled Moai is an ancestor who has been cut off, whose power has been interrupted, whose watchful presence over the community has been ended. The toppling of Moai, whether it was done by rival clans in conflict or by the community itself in response to some perceived failure of ancestral protection, was a profound cultural act, not merely vandalism. The re-erection of Moai by the modern archaeological program, conducted in close collaboration with the Rapa Nui community, is therefore not simply a preservation or tourism project. It is, in Rapa Nui cultural terms, a restoration of ancestral presence, a reconnection of the living community with the ancestors who were toppled and who have been waiting to be restored. The community members who have participated in the re-erection program describe it in these terms, and their participation in the work is not merely practical but ceremonial, attended by the protocols of respect toward ancestors that the tradition requires. The ahu on which the Moai stand are themselves complex structures with long histories. They began as simple burial platforms, the bones of the important dead placed in and under the stone, and they developed over the centuries into elaborate ceremonial structures, some of them extended and reinforced multiple times as successive generations added to the achievements of their predecessors. The largest Ahu Tongariki on the south coast of the island, is a massive construction more than 200 meters long, bearing 15 moai of varying sizes, and its construction and the erection of its statues required the labor investment of a substantial community sustained over an extended period. Ahu Tongariki was devastated by the 1960 Chilean earthquake, which generated a tsunami that struck Rapa Nui with enough force to scatter the moai inland from their platform. The subsequent restoration of the Ahu and the re-erection of its 15 moai, conducted by a Japanese team in the 1990s with community involvement, was a massive engineering project that required cranes and heavy machinery and the logistical support of a modern international restoration program. The comparison with the original construction, achieved without any of these resources, gives some sense of what the original builders accomplished. The astronomical knowledge that some researchers believe was encoded in the orientation and placement of the moai and their Ahu adds another dimension to the picture of Rapa Nui civilization as a sophisticated intellectual culture rather than a simple pre-literate society. Many Ahu appear to be oriented with reference to specific astronomical events, the rising or setting of particular stars, or the solar solstices and equinoxes, in ways that would have required careful observation over extended periods and the accumulation of astronomical knowledge precise enough to guide construction decisions. Whether this orientation was deliberate and systematic across the island's Ahu, or whether it reflects partial patterns that have been overinterpreted by researchers looking for astronomical significance, is debated. What is not debated is that the Rapa Nui people, like most pre-industrial peoples who depended on agriculture and navigation, were careful astronomical observers. They had to be. The agricultural calendar of an island, the timing of planting and harvest, the management of water resources, the anticipation of seasonal changes, all required a practical understanding of the sky and its patterns. The navigation tradition that brought their ancestors to the island required astronomical knowledge of a high order, and the cultural tradition of Rongorongo may have included astronomical records as one of its subject matters. The Tahitian bishop Jausen, who first recognized Rongorongo as writing and who made the first serious attempt to decipher it in the 1860s and 1870s, noted that some of the sequences he observed appeared to relate to astronomical or calendrical information. Subsequent scholars have developed this observation, proposing that some sections of the surviving tablets may encode lunar or agricultural calendars. If this is correct, the tablets represent not only a writing system, but a scientific record, a tool for managing the practical knowledge that an island community needed to sustain itself across generations. The loss of Rongorongo to decipherment is therefore not only a cultural loss, but potentially a scientific one. Whatever practical knowledge the tablets encoded, whatever accumulated understanding of the island's ecology, its agricultural calendar, its astronomical cycles, was encoded in a system that we cannot read. The possibility that the tablets contain information that would enhance our understanding of both Rapa Nui's specific environment and the broader intellectual history of the Pacific is real, and it is permanently beyond reach because the people who could have provided the key were taken away. The cultural transmission of knowledge in a society without writing depends on institutions of memory, people and practices dedicated to the preservation and accurate transmission of what the community needs to know across generations. The Tangata Rongorongo, the men of knowledge, were exactly this kind of institution, trained from childhood in the memorization and interpretation of the tablets, their knowledge making them essential to the ritual and practical life of the community. Their loss was therefore not just the loss of individuals, but the loss of an institution, the irreversible disruption of a system of knowledge transmission that required decades to establish and could not be reconstructed from outside. This makes the slave raids of 1862 a specifically targeted attack on Rapa Nui knowledge, even if that targeting was unintentional from the slavers' perspective. The slavers were not attempting to destroy Rapa Nui culture. They were attempting to acquire labor. But the people they chose, the young, the healthy, the men of authority, were precisely the people on whom the transmission of Rapa Nui knowledge depended, and their removal broke the chain of transmission at its most critical link. The parallel with other colonial processes of knowledge destruction is not accidental. The burning of indigenous language books in New Spain, the prohibition of indigenous language instruction in colonial schools, the forced removal of indigenous children from their communities in the residential school systems of North America and Australia, all of these are forms of the same process, the disruption of knowledge transmission systems in ways that accelerate cultural loss far beyond what simple external contact would produce. The Rapa Nui case is particularly stark because it happened so quickly and so completely, but the mechanism is familiar from the broader history of colonialism. The recovery of Rapa Nui culture in the century and a half since the Nadir of 1877 has been remarkable in its determination and partial in its results. The Rapa Nui language, which was still being spoken by the tiny remnant community of 1877, survived and has been revitalized through deliberate language education and cultural programs. Rapa Nui is now taught in schools on the island, spoken in homes, used in public life alongside Spanish, and the younger generation is more fluent in it than the middle generation that grew up when assimilation to Chilean Spanish culture was more aggressively promoted. The traditional performing arts, the music and dance that are central to Rapa Nui cultural expression, were preserved through the catastrophic period and have been revived and elaborated in the contemporary community. The annual Tapati Festival, which celebrates Rapa Nui culture through competitions in traditional arts, sports, and knowledge, has become a major event in the island's cultural calendar, drawing participants from across the Rapa Nui diaspora communities in Chile and elsewhere. The carving tradition, which produced the moai and the various smaller wood and stone carvings that were another important form of Rapa Nui artistic expression, has been maintained and revived by contemporary Rapa Nui artists who work in both traditional forms and contemporary idioms. The carvers of today are connected to a tradition that stretches back centuries, and their work maintains the visual vocabulary of a culture that has survived everything that was done to erase it. The political awakening of the Rapa Nui community, which has been expressed through formal advocacy for autonomy, repatriation, and recognition of colonial harms, is part of a broader pattern of indigenous resurgence that has been one of the significant political developments of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Indigenous communities around the world, whose numbers were once expected by colonial authorities to dwindle to nothing, have instead survived and in many cases grown, and have used the legal and political frameworks available to them in the post-colonial world to press their claims with increasing effectiveness. The Rapa Nui community has been particularly effective in internationalizing its case, partly because the global fame of the Moai provides a platform for the island's advocacy that most indigenous communities lack. When the governor of Easter Island speaks at international forums about the right of the Rapa Nui people to their cultural heritage, the Moai are in the room with her, not physically, but as the shared reference point that makes the conversation legible to a global audience. The statues that were supposed to represent a failed civilization are instead evidence of a living one, and that living civilization is using them to make its claims heard. The story that the world thought it knew about Easter Island was a story about a warning, about what happens when people destroy their own environment. The true story is different. It is a story about what happens when an outside force destroys a people's environment for them, taking their labor, their leaders, their knowledge keepers, their cultural objects, and their autonomy, and leaving them with 111 survivors on an island that had sustained thousands for centuries. It is a story about what those survivors did with what remained to them, how they and their children and their children's children rebuilt from almost nothing, maintaining the language and the cultural practices and the political consciousness that would eventually allow them to stand before the institutions of the world that hold their ancestors and say, "Give them back." The Moai face inland. They always have. From the moment they were placed on their ahu, they turned their backs on the ocean and looked toward the community they were made to protect. The community they are looking for is still there. It is smaller than it once was, and it has been through things that would have destroyed many societies less determined, but it is there, and it is not finished, and it is still insisting on the truth of its own history. The most remote inhabited island on earth is inhabited. The people who inhabit it have been here for 800 years. Their ancestors are in the stone, watching. The ocean is the same ocean their founding sailors crossed to bring them here. The stars they navigate by are the same stars. And the statues, the ones that walked to their platforms, the ones that were toppled and some re-erected, and some still waiting in museum cases in London and other cities of the world, are part of a story that has not yet reached its end. The Rapa Nui people are writing that end themselves, in their own language, in their own time, on the terms they choose. Their ancestors never disappeared. They were taken. The difference matters enormously, and the Rapa Nui people, 7,000 strong, are making sure the world knows it.